And now, in the stillness of this moment, we bring you the final thrilling chapter.
Welcome to Twilight Howl, where shadows stir and darkness whispers. Every tale beats with life. Can you feel its pulse? Will you dare to listen? Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, remember, the night has many voices. Sleep, if you can. We having fun now. Every October, my friend Lucy hosts a Halloween dinner party at her old family home. It's an annual tradition. She invites a close group of friends, decorates the place with an over-the-top spooky theme, and prepares an elaborate home-cooked meal. This year, she decided to go all out with a Victorian-style haunted house theme. Candelabras, cobwebs, vintage portraits with faces scratched out, and even a full, ornate table setting with antique silverware and plates. The whole vibe was meticulously eerie, perfect for Halloween. The night of the party. I arrived a bit early to help her with last-minute decorations and setting up the table. Lucy was in the kitchen, whipping up what she called a secret recipe for the main course. She looked stressed, muttering to herself as she stirred a thick, dark stew in an old pot. The smell was strange, rich, almost metallic, and somehow sweet. It filled the entire house. As the guests began to arrive, Lucy insisted that we all sit at the table and stay put until everything was ready. Her tone was almost stern, and it felt out of character. Lucy was normally easygoing, but tonight she seemed on edge, hyper-focused. She had even hired a friend of hers to serve as a waiter, dressed in a vintage butler's uniform to fit the theme. The table was beautifully set, each place marked by a handwritten name card and an old-fashioned goblet filled with dark red wine. I noticed the silverware had intricate engravings, but they seemed worn, as if they had been used countless times before. I asked Lucy where she got them, and she just shrugged.
They've been in my family for generations,
she said, her eyes not meeting mine. Once everyone was seated, the lights dimmed, and the butler brought out the first course, a blood-red beet soup, thick and almost velvety. We all sipped it, joking about how it looked like something a vampire would drink. But as I drank, I noticed an odd aftertaste, a hint of iron that lingered in my mouth. I mentioned it to Lucy, but she just smiled, her eyes flickering in the candlelight. As the courses went on, the food got stranger. The second dish was a rich pâté spread on dark, almost black bread. It tasted unusual, smoky, earthy, and slightly bitter. I asked Lucy what it was made of, and she just winked and said,
a family recipe.
The rest of the group seemed a little uneasy, glancing at each other, murmuring, but no one dared to refuse the food. The atmosphere was so tense that everyone just went along with it. Finally, the main course arrived. The butler brought out a large, covered silver platter and set it in the center of the table. Lucy stood up and made a little speech about family traditions and the spirit of Halloween, how it was a time to honor the dead. Then, with a flourish, she lifted the lid. Inside was a massive roast, glistening and steaming, with an aroma so intense that it filled the room in seconds. It looked like some sort of game meat, but none of us could place it. The meat was dark, almost purplish, and seemed to have a layer of fine bones, or cartilage, embedded in it. I noticed a few people at the table exchanging uneasy glances, but Lucy urged us to dig in. As I cut into my piece, the knife met resistance, almost like it was hitting a tendon or ligament. It took effort to slice through it. The first bite was tough, chewy, with an unusual flavor I couldn't describe. It wasn't like any meat I'd ever tasted before. Something about it felt wrong. Halfway through the meal, one of my friends, Max, set down his fork and whispered, "Lucy, what kind of meat is this?" His face was pale, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Lucy's expression didn't change. She simply smiled and replied,
It's an old family recipe, but I suppose you could say it's venison.
Something in her tone made my stomach twist. We all continued eating, more out of social obligation than enjoyment. But as I chewed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. After dinner, Lucy suggested we play a Halloween game in the basement. Everyone hesitated, but she insisted, saying it was part of the family tradition. She led us downstairs, the butler following with a candelabra. The basement was cold and damp, with walls lined with old wooden shelves, stacked with dusty jars and ancient bottles. It felt like stepping into another century. Lucy directed us to form a circle and hold hands. She started chanting something in a low voice, her eyes closed. The words didn't make any sense. They sounded like gibberish, a mix of Latin and something else. We all joined hands, feeling uncomfortable, but too afraid to break the circle. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the basement, extinguishing the candles. The darkness was absolute, and I could hear someone breathing heavily next to me. Then, out of nowhere, a loud bang echoed through the room, as if something heavy had fallen or been thrown against the wall. The lights flickered back on, and Lucy was standing in the center of the circle, staring at us with a strange, hollow expression. Her face looked gaunt, almost skeletal, her eyes sunken and shadowed. She didn't say a word, just smiled, that eerie smile. One by one, we quickly excused ourselves and left, mumbling about early mornings or work commitments. No one wanted to be the last to leave. As I got into my car, I glanced back at the house and saw Lucy watching us from the front window, her face obscured by shadows. For weeks after, I couldn't get the taste of that dinner out of my mouth. It haunted me, a sickening memory that made my stomach turn. I tried asking Lucy about the dinner later, but she acted like she didn't remember. Eventually, I found out that Lucy's family had a long history in town, going back to the 1800s. Some locals whispered that they practiced strange rituals, and that the house itself was cursed. No one knew exactly what they meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we ate that night was something we weren't supposed to. To this day, I can't look at roast meat without feeling a chill, remembering that night, and Lucy's strange, hollow smile. Every Christmas, my family gathers at my grandparents' house for dinner. It's an old grand house, filled with dark wood furniture, antique decorations, and portraits of long-dead ancestors lining the hallways. The place always felt a little too quiet, especially in the winter, but it held so many memories, so we kept coming back, year after year. Last year, however, something happened that none of us can explain. To this day, I can't look at roast meat without feeling a chill, remembering that night and Lucy's strange, hollow smile. It was a particularly cold Christmas Eve. Snow covered everything in sight. The entire family was gathered in the dining room, eagerly awaiting the traditional holiday feast. My grandmother had prepared all the usual dishes: roast turkey, glazed ham, mashed potatoes, and her famous Christmas pudding. The food looked perfect, like something straight out of a holiday magazine. Just as we were about to start, the lights in the house flickered, and then, unexpectedly, the front door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was an unfamiliar man, his coat dusted with snow, looking as though he traveled a great distance. We all froze, staring at him in stunned silence. My grandmother was the first to speak, breaking the silence with a warm smile. She invited him in, as though she had been expecting him all along.
This is Mr. Fletcher. He'll be our special guest tonight.
I'd never heard of anyone named Fletcher before, and judging by the expressions around the table, no one else had either. But no one wanted to challenge Grandma, especially not on Christmas Eve. Mr. Fletcher took a seat at the head of the table, across from my grandfather. His gaze swept over each of us, his face pale, his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. As dinner began, the atmosphere grew tense. Fletcher barely spoke, only watching us with an odd, unsettling smile. Whenever someone tried to make small talk, he'd just nod slightly, but his attention would always return to each person, as though he was studying us. Every time I glanced in his direction, I found him looking directly at me, his stare piercing. Halfway through the meal, he lifted his glass and said, "Tonight is a special night, isn't it?" His voice was low and cold, almost like it echoed from another place. He took a slow sip, then continued, "A night to honor those who have passed." A shiver ran down my spine. My parents and a few other relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Grandma simply smiled, as if she understood everything he meant. After dinner, Grandma stood up and invited us to the basement for a special Christmas ritual. We all hesitated, but she insisted, saying it was a family tradition that went back generations. Reluctantly, we followed her down the narrow staircase, each of us holding a candle, the air growing colder with every step. When we reached the basement, Grandma instructed us to form a circle around the room, each of us holding our candles high. Mr. Fletcher stood in the center, his eyes glinting in the dim candlelight. Grandma began to chant something, a soft, almost melodic whisper that sounded ancient and strange, like a language from another time. One by one, Mr. Fletcher took each of our hands in his icy grip, looking into our eyes with a piercing stare that sent chills through my entire body. When he touched my hand, I felt an inexplicable jolt of cold that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, Fletcher lifted his head and said, his voice echoing through the basement, "Listen, they are here." At that moment, all the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into absolute darkness. I could feel a rush of icy air, and for a brief second, I heard faint whispers, as if distant voices were murmuring from the shadows around us. Then, one by one, the candles slowly relit, casting eerie shadows on Grandma's face as she gazed into the dark, as if seeing something we couldn't. After a long, tense silence, she turned back to us, her face calm, almost serene.
The ritual is complete. We may return?
Everyone hurried back up the stairs, no one daring to question what had just happened. As we returned to the living room, I glanced back and saw Fletcher still standing at the bottom of the staircase, watching us leave, his face shrouded in darkness. When the family prepared to leave for the night, I looked around but couldn't see Fletcher anywhere. I asked Grandma where he'd gone, and she gave me a mysterious smile. "He's gone back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fletcher isn't from this world," she added softly, her eyes twinkling with a strange, unreadable look. I couldn't tell if she was joking or serious. That night, I had a vivid nightmare. In my dream, Fletcher was standing in the doorway of my room, watching me with those deep, haunting eyes. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Since that Christmas Eve, our family hasn't returned to my grandparents' house, and every time I think back to that night, I can't shake the question of who Mr. Fletcher really was, and what kind of ritual my grandmother performed in that basement. His last lingering gaze still haunts me, as if he left a piece of himself within our family. Forever. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, feeling as if his presence still lingered in the air. Every summer, my friends and I plan a camping trip to a remote spot deep in the forest, away from cell service, Wi-Fi, and all the distractions of everyday life. It's become a tradition. We gather around the campfire, tell stories, grill some food, and drink under the stars until we're too tired to keep our eyes open. But last year, something happened. It's made me wary of ever going back into the woods. There were 5 of us on that trip. Me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and another couple, Dan and Ashley. We'd chosen a new campsite that Mike had heard about, one that was supposedly untouched and deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone. It took hours of hiking to get there, lugging all our gear and supplies along narrow trails that seemed to wind endlessly. But once we arrived, it was worth it. The place was beautiful. Dense trees, a small clearing, and a river nearby for fresh water. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. By the time we set up camp, the sun was starting to set. We built a fire, and the smoke curled up into the sky as we started cooking. Everything was perfect. The smell of the food, the crackling of the flames, the sound of the river in the distance. It was quiet and peaceful, almost too quiet. As night fell, an eerie silence settled over the campsite, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. After dinner, we sat around the fire, laughing and telling stories. Dan decided to tell one of his scary campfire tales about some old urban legend. Halfway through his story, we heard a faint rustling from the darkness beyond the light of our fire. Everyone went silent, staring into the trees, but we couldn't see anything. We shrugged it off, laughing nervously and blaming it on the wind or a small animal. But then, it happened again. This time, it was louder. The rustling was accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like something sharp dragging across wood. Mike, being the brave one, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just empty forest. "Probably a raccoon," he said, chuckling, but his laugh sounded forced. We tried to get back to our storytelling, but the atmosphere had changed. There was an uncomfortable tension that none of us could shake. Sarah suggested that we turn in early, and everyone agreed. We each crawled into our tents, but I couldn't fall asleep. The silence was too heavy, pressing down on us, and I kept thinking about that strange noise. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. At first, I thought it was one of my friends, maybe heading to the river, but the footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling around my tent. My heart started to pound. I held my breath, listening, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Then, I heard a faint whisper. It was so quiet, like someone was speaking just under their breath. But I couldn't make out any words. My skin prickled with fear, and I clutched my sleeping bag, too terrified to move. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away, and I lay there, paralyzed, straining to hear anything else. In the morning, I asked the others if they'd heard anything, but no one else seemed to have been disturbed. Mike joked about forest spirits and did his best ghostly impression, but I could tell he hadn't heard the footsteps. I was relieved, but a part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. The next night, the tension around the campsite was even worse. We tried to keep up the usual campfire banter, but everyone seemed on edge. As we sat around the fire, I noticed something strange. There were 6 chairs around the fire, even though there were only 5 of us. I counted them again, thinking maybe someone had dragged over a log, but there it was, 6 chairs, one of them empty. "Hey, did someone bring an extra chair?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Everyone turned to look, and we all froze. Dan was the first to laugh, nervously. "Guess the forest wants a seat too," he joked, but no one else laughed. Feeling spooked, we decided to call it an early night again, but just as I turned to put out the fire, Mike stopped me. "Wait, who put out the other fire?" he asked, pointing just beyond our campsite. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. There, barely visible through the trees, was another faint glow, a small fire, flickering in the darkness. It looked almost like a mirror image of ours, but we could only see it when the wind shifted, causing the trees to sway.
Maybe it's just someone camping nearby.
Ashley suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. We hadn't seen another soul since we'd arrived, and this spot was miles from any other campsite. Reluctantly, we left our fire burning and crawled back into our tents, each of us too unnerved to sleep. I kept glancing out of my tent, watching that distant glow. Around midnight, the glow began to flicker, as if someone were moving around it. Then slowly, it started to move, getting closer to our campsite. My heart was pounding as I watched it creep closer, the firelight flickering through the trees, casting strange shadows. And then, it stopped, just outside our campsite, barely visible through the thick foliage. I could almost make out figures moving around it, shadowy shapes that seemed to sway and twist. Suddenly, I heard that scraping sound again, loud and clear, like something dragging along the ground. The whispering started, faint but unmistakable, just outside my tent. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut, willing it to go away. Then, from the darkness, I heard a voice, a low, rasping whisper that sounded close enough to be inside my tent. "Won't you join us?" I felt a cold chill run down my spine, and I bolted upright, grabbing my flashlight and shining it around. But there was no one there. The whispering stopped, the scraping sound faded, and when I looked toward the other fire, it was gone. The forest was silent, eerily silent. In the morning, I told everyone what I'd heard, and they admitted they'd been hearing whispers too. We packed up as quickly as we could, not saying much, all of us eager to leave that place behind. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I glanced back once more and froze. In the distance, through the trees, I could see a faint glow, another campfire, with shadowy figures gathered around it, watching us as we disappeared into the forest. Since then, none of us have returned to that campsite, and we rarely talk about what happened. But sometimes I dream about it. The empty chair, the whispers, and the invitation to join a fire that wasn't meant for the living. It all started out as a joke. My friend Ethan, a self-proclaimed internet explorer, dared me to try browsing the dark web. I was hesitant at first. I knew it was the hidden part of the internet, filled with illegal activities, anonymous forums, and things no one was supposed to see. but curiosity got the best of me. One Friday night, after a couple of drinks and too many horror movies, I decided to take a look. I installed the necessary software, a special browser that allows access to these hidden sites, and began to browse. Ethan sent me a few links to start, mostly just sketchy-looking message boards and strange, cryptic websites. I wasn't impressed. Most of it looked like outdated conspiracy theories, bad graphic design, and amateur hackers trying too hard to sound mysterious. But then Ethan sent me one last link, saying, "This one is for food lovers like you." I clicked on it, and the page loaded a website titled The Dark Web Cookbook. The background was pitch black, and all the text was in dark red, barely readable. There was a disclaimer at the top, for those with refined tastes and a hunger for the unusual. My stomach twisted, but I couldn't look away. Each recipe on the site had a strange, macabre title: Midsummer Night Stew, Harvested Delicacies, The Ultimate Cut. They sounded more like titles from a horror movie than actual recipes. Despite the chill running down my spine, I clicked on one of them. Chef's Special. The page opened up, and a list of ingredients appeared, but they weren't like anything I'd ever seen in a cookbook. It listed things like fresh tissue, hemoglobin extract, and delicately aged marrow. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself that this was just some sick joke, like a Halloween-themed website for horror fans. But as I scrolled down, I noticed detailed preparation steps, complete with photos that were unsettlingly realistic. The meat in the images didn't look like any kind I'd seen before. It was pinkish gray, almost like... I closed the page, my heart racing. I decided I'd had enough for the night and shut down my laptop, but I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The ingredients, the detailed steps, and especially the photos of that strange meat. I felt nauseous just thinking about it. The next day, I told Ethan about it, hoping he'd laugh and reassure me that it was all fake. But he looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Dude, I just found that link randomly on a forum. I didn't think it'd be anything serious." He paused, looking almost scared. "Did you bookmark it?" I shook my head. I didn't want anything like that saved on my computer. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept seeing flashes of those pictures in my mind. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could still smell that metallic, sickly sweet aroma. I tried to forget about it, but something inside me felt drawn to that site, as if it had planted a seed in my mind. A few nights later, I couldn't resist the urge any longer. I opened my laptop, reinstalled the browser, and tried to find the link again. After an hour of searching, I finally found it. The Dark Web Cookbook. The page loaded slowly, as if the site was reluctant to reveal itself to me again. This time I clicked on a different recipe titled The Crimson Roast. The instructions were similar, detailed, precise, and filled with strange ingredients like vital essence and vital sinew extract. There were photos again, this time showing a whole roast prepared with herbs and some kind of dark, glistening sauce. The meat looked more structured, like a person's arm or leg, though it was partially covered in garnishes. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. I felt sick, yet fascinated. I scrolled down and found a section at the bottom of the page titled Community Reviews. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The reviews were chilling. Incredible flavor, almost like nothing else I've tasted. User, Gourmet Hunter, 78. Took a bit to source the ingredients, but well worth the effort. User, Culinary Darkness. Pairs well with red wine. Let it age for a week for the best flavor. User, Taste for Life. The comments went on, each one more disturbing than the last. The users talked about hunting for ingredients, and some even exchanged tips on preserving freshness, I realized with horror that these people were serious. This wasn't a joke. They were sharing actual advice on preparing human flesh. Panicked, I closed my laptop again, my hands shaking. I felt like I'd stumbled into something forbidden, something that should have never been seen. I tried to tell myself it was fake, some twisted prank on unsuspecting visitors. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. A few days passed, and I started to notice strange things happening. Packages would show up at my doorstep, no labels, just wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside were ingredients from the site, things I'd never ordered. A small jar labeled marrow essence, a vial of something dark and viscous with the words hemoglobin extract, and once, a small container labeled simply bone powder. The sight of these packages made my skin crawl, and I threw them away immediately. But they kept coming, each one more grotesque than the last. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what might show up next. I tried to contact the website, but there was no contact information, no way to reach anyone. The site itself was gone from my browser history, and I couldn't find the link again no matter how much I searched. Then one night, I heard footsteps outside my apartment. Quiet, steady footsteps pacing back and forth. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was a dark figure standing just out of view, like they knew I was watching. The packages stopped coming after that night, but the sense of dread never left. I moved a few months later, hoping that would finally put an end to it. But every once in a while, I still get that feeling, like someone's watching me, waiting for something. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I'll find another package on my doorstep, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Inside, there's always a small jar or vial, labeled with something too horrific to describe. I've learned my lesson. Some recipes are never meant to be tasted, and some sights are never meant to be seen. But once you've opened the door to that world, it's not so easy to close it again. It had been a while since I'd used Tinder. After a rough breakup, I decided to give dating a break, focusing on work and spending time with friends. But one night, feeling particularly lonely, I decided to download the app again. I told myself it was just for fun, just a way to pass the time and see who was out there. I swiped through profiles, not expecting much. Then I came across Evan. He was handsome in a subtle way, with a warm smile and kind eyes. He didn't look like the typical bad boy or party guy that usually flooded my matches. His profile mentioned he liked reading, cooking, and exploring old buildings. Something about him felt safe. We matched instantly. He sent a message right away. "Hey, it's nice to meet you. I'm Evan." Our conversation flowed effortlessly. He was witty, intelligent, and genuinely interested in what I had to say. Over the next few days, we exchanged stories, talked about our favorite books and movies, and shared little details about our lives. It was rare to find someone I connected with so easily. After about a week of chatting, Evan suggested we meet up. He invited me to a cozy little bar he loved, tucked away in a quiet part of the city. Part of me hesitated. Meeting up with someone from Tinder always carried a bit of risk, but something about Evan felt different, comforting. I agreed, and we planned to meet the next evening. The bar was charming, just like he'd described. Dim lights, rustic furniture, and a warm, welcoming vibe. I arrived early and took a seat by the window, nervously checking my phone. A few minutes later, Evan walked in, just as he looked in his pictures. He had that same warm smile and easygoing charm. "Hey," he said, smiling as he took a seat across from me. It's so good to finally meet you in person. We spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing stories. He was exactly as he'd seemed in our chats, thoughtful, attentive, and funny. I felt completely at ease around him. At one point, he even made a comment about feeling like we'd known each other for years. I nodded, feeling the same way. When it was time to leave, he offered to walk me to my car. As we stepped outside, the air was chilly, and I shivered. Without hesitation, he took off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders. The gesture was so sweet, so genuine, and it made my heart skip a beat. "Can I see you again?" he asked, his eyes hopeful. I smiled and nodded. I'd like that. Over the next few weeks, we went on several dates, each one better than the last. Evan was practically perfect, always kind, always thoughtful, always saying and doing just the right things. But every once in a while, there was something off, little things that didn't quite add up. He'd make a comment about a place he'd never been, but then later say he'd visited it often. Or he'd talk about a favorite book, only to contradict himself about the plot later. One night, while lying in bed, I had a strange thought. What did I really know about Evan? We'd been seeing each other for weeks, but he'd never mentioned his family or any friends. There was no sign of him on social media. And every time I'd ask him about his past, he'd skillfully dodge the question. Curiosity got the best of me. I decided to do a quick search online, thinking maybe I'd find an old Facebook profile or something harmless. But there was nothing. No trace of him anywhere. No social media, no public records, nothing. Feeling a little unsettled, I mentioned it to my friend Lisa the next day. She raised an eyebrow.
You mean to tell me he's a ghost online? No Instagram, no Facebook, nothing?
Yeah, I replied, laughing nervously. Maybe he's just private? Lisa didn't look convinced.
Just be careful, okay? He seems a little too perfect, if you know what I mean.
That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I messaged Evan, asking him to send me a quick selfie. He replied almost instantly with a photo, smiling in his apartment, holding up a book I'd recommended. It was reassuring, but something still felt off. Then I noticed something strange in the background of the photo. A corkboard on the wall filled with photos and notes. I squinted, zooming in on the image. My stomach dropped as I recognized one of the photos. It was a picture of me. Taken from a distance, sitting at my favorite coffee shop. I remembered that day. I was alone, and I hadn't told anyone I'd be there. Heart pounding, I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. I forced myself to calm down, convincing myself it was a coincidence, a trick of the light, but something inside me knew better. The next day, I decided to end things. I sent him a message, saying I didn't think we should see each other anymore. He replied almost immediately, asking me why, pleading for an explanation. I ignored it. For the rest of the day, my phone buzzed constantly with messages from him, each one more desperate than the last. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a soft buzzing sound. My phone was on silent, but it was still lighting up. When I glanced at it, my blood ran cold. There was a message from Evan, a simple text that read, "I'm outside." My heart pounded as I carefully peeked through my window. There, standing on the sidewalk, was Evan, staring up at my apartment, his face partially obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there watching. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That I had a weird feeling about a guy I met on Tinder? After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to look outside again, but he was gone. The next day, I blocked him on every platform, deleted Tinder, and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. I'd catch glimpses of him on the street, or see shadows outside my window at night. Once, I found a note slipped under my door that simply read, "Miss you." I moved a few months later, hoping it would put an end to everything, and for the most part, it did. But every now and then, I get the feeling that I'm still being watched, that Evan hasn't let go, even though I've tried to. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a soft tapping at my window, followed by silence. And though I've never dared to look, I always wonder if I'll see him standing there, waiting, hoping for one last chance. It was our senior year of high school, and my friends, Jack, Lisa, Tom, and I, were always looking for the next thrill. We'd heard rumors, whispers, about an old abandoned school on the outskirts of town. A place that used to be prestigious, but had closed down decades ago. For mysterious reasons. People said that late at night, you could hear footsteps echoing through the halls, or see shadowy figures slipping past the windows. Naturally, we couldn't resist checking it out. On a chilly Saturday night, we met at the front gate of the school. The building loomed in the moonlight, its broken windows and faded walls covered in creeping vines. The air was thick with silence, and a strange feeling settled over us. Like we were being watched. We took a deep breath and pushed open the rusted gate, its screech echoing into the night.
This place is seriously creepy.
Lisa whispered, but none of us were willing to back out. Jack found a window, open just enough for us to crawl through. And one by one, we slipped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust and memories, as if the building itself held its breath, waiting for us to make a move. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of mold and dust. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating long, empty hallways, lined with old lockers and cracked linoleum floors. "It feels like everything here just froze in time," Tom murmured, his voice barely breaking the silence. We started exploring the classrooms, one by one. Some were mostly intact, dusty desks, faded posters still clinging to the walls, while others had been vandalized or were littered with debris. In one classroom, we noticed something scribbled on the blackboard, faint. Uneven letters forming a chilling message. "Don't go to the gym." Well, obviously, we have to go to the gym now, Jack joked, though his voice was a little unsteady. We found the gym, at the end of a dark hallway. The heavy wooden doors creaked loudly as we pushed them open, and the room beyond was pitch black. Our flashlights barely reached the far corners of the gym, casting faint, shaky beams into the shadows. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing loudly in the emptiness. The place felt colder, somehow, as if the temperature had dropped just in this one room. Then, Lisa froze.
Did you guys hear that?
We stopped, and listened. Somewhere in the darkness, we heard a faint whispering sound. It was too quiet to make out words, but the tone was chilling, like someone muttering angrily or pleading in desperation. "We should leave," I said, feeling a wave of unease wash over me, but Jack was already moving forward, his flashlight sweeping across the gym floor. Then, in the far corner, something caught the beam of his flashlight, a dark figure, standing just at the edge of the light. At first, I thought it was a statue, or maybe a mannequin left over from an old play. But then, it moved, shifting slightly, as if it were watching us. We froze, staring. The figure was tall, shrouded in what looked like ragged, dark clothing. Its face was impossible to see clearly, but there was an eerie glow, right where its eyes should have been. It just stood there, silent and still, as if sizing us up.
Run.
Lisa hissed, grabbing my arm. None of us needed to be told twice. We turned and bolted for the door, our footsteps echoing wildly as we sprinted out of the gym, back down the hallway. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw the figure, slowly moving after us, gliding almost unnaturally, its eyes fixed on us, with that same cold, unblinking stare. We didn't stop until we were out of the building, practically tumbling through the window we'd climbed in. We ran all the way back to our cars, too terrified to look back, convinced that the figure was right behind us. Once we were safely inside Jack's car, doors locked, and engine running, we finally took a moment to breathe. None of us spoke. We just stared ahead, too shaken to process what had just happened. Jack sped away from the school, and in the rearview mirror, I saw the dark silhouette of the building, fading into the night. But that eerie feeling, that icy chill, lingered with us, as if something or someone was still watching. After that night, none of us ever talked about going back. The thrill of exploring abandoned places had been replaced with a cold, lingering fear. We realized that sometimes places are abandoned for a reason, and some things are better left alone. The memories stayed with us, haunting our thoughts, a silent reminder that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Even now, I occasionally drive past the outskirts of town, where the school sits, shrouded in darkness. Whenever I do, I feel a chill run down my spine, and I always speed up, not daring to look back. It's as if some part of me knows that something still waits there, watching, hidden in the shadows.
And so, dear listeners, our time together comes to an end, but the stories, they never truly fade. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your heart steady, for the unknown awaits. This has been Twilight Howl. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and have a great day. See you next time.